sit yourselves down again for the final session of Block 2 of ELTOC, and it's great to introduce Kate, who is the Pedagogy Research Manager in the ELT Division at OUP. She's got a PhD in Applied Linguistics from the University of Cambridge and an MSc in Applied Linguistics Second Language Acquisition from the University of Oxford. Nice balance, Cambridge and Oxford. Her interest in academic research originates in her English language teaching experience in the UK, in Belgium, and in Ukraine, where she worked with various students, from children to international language students, to business executives, and also academics. And she is going to talk to us today about mixed ability. So, Kate, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to be here, and thanks to everyone who's listening to this last session. I know for some of you it's quite late or quite early, so thank you for that. So today in this presentation, we're talking about mixed ability teaching. It's probably a hot topic for many of you. I know that lots of teachers ask advice on this, so hopefully this session will be useful, and hopefully you'll get some practical ideas and tips out of this. But first, I just wanted to acknowledge that the presentation draws on content in our book, Mixed Ability Teaching. This is from the Into the Classroom series. So I'd just like to thank the knowledge and expertise of the authors of the book, Edmund Dudley and Erica Oswald, because they have very much informed the content of what I'm going to share with you today. So, to begin with, we are going to imagine a few different scenarios in an English language classroom. As I read through the different classroom episodes, imaginary episodes, can you put something in the chat, like a plus or a yes, if this is something that happened to you in your teaching experience? So if you recognize this as something that happened to you, just put a yes or a plus in the chat, okay? So here's the first one. In the process of checking homework, the teacher notices that half of the class haven't done it. Surprise, surprise. And decides to give everyone some time to check the answers in pairs, hoping that this will allow everyone to catch up. Some students simply hand their completed homework to their partners to copy, while others pull out their phones. Oh yeah, I can see lots of pluses coming in. That's a situation that happens to all of us. All right, good. Yeah, I can see lots of pluses coming in. Keep this going. If you find that there's something you recognize, put a plus. Here's another one for you. Episode 2. So the teacher sets up a reading comprehension task for the class and sets a time limit. Some students finish quicker, while others don't manage to get to the end. So the teacher starts asking students the comprehension questions. One student hesitates, not sure, and someone whispers the correct answer across the room. The teacher asks another student, but they have moved on to something else. They are doing the next activity already. Another student points out that everyone has already heard the answer, so what's the point? And, well, that's the end of your activity. Yeah, I see, Gloria, lots of pluses. Is that something that happens often? Okay, good, yes, I can see that. Typical, yes, yeah. Right, well, I have the last one for you, the last episode, number 3. When the teacher asks an open-ended question after watching an interesting video, some students put up their hands, and one of them just starts speaking without being called out. Other students lower their hands and seem frustrated because their ideas have already been partly expressed in that response, and nobody raises their hand for the next question, and the same student gets to speak again. Yeah. I can see pluses again and yeses. So yeah, I can see that lots of people can relate to these situations in the classroom. So all of these situations, they illustrate some of the things that can go wrong in a mixed ability classroom. And those are all situations that have happened in my teaching practice as well, so I didn't even make them up. These are actually real. I said they were imaginary, but actually they are real. So hopefully the session will help us to come up with some better solutions for some of these situations. I'm not saying that we're going to be able to tackle everything and everything will be ideal from now on, but hopefully this presentation will help you. So first, let's discuss what we really mean by mixed ability. When we say mixed ability, I think we often mean the different proficiency levels of students. So let's say our class is supposed to be B1, but actually some of our students are A2, some of our students are actually B2. There's one C1 student who shouldn't really be there, and there are a couple of A1 if we're really honest. However, mixed ability is actually more than that. It is usually a combination of different factors. So if you think back to these situations, these episodes that we were talking about, can you think of any other factors or any other variables that are different in a mixed ability classroom, except proficiency? What else varies across students? If you can put it in chat, any other things that seem to vary in a mixed ability group, except proficiency. So obviously proficiency, yes, we recognize that this is a very, very common mother tongue. Okay, good, Caroline, thanks. So your students might be speaking different languages. Interest in the subject, yeah, different skills, different confidence. Social background, speed, oh, that's a good one. Cultural background, character, absolutely. Writing skills, some don't like working in groups. Oh yeah, absolutely. Age, yeah. Motivation, functional literacy, shyness, yeah. IQ, yeah. Extroversion, aptitude, oh, these are very, very good points. I think you have basically covered the points that I have, that I'm going to present. So proficiency, yes, this is a big one, of course. The other one, many of you have mentioned, is motivation. So we can talk about the different nature of motivation. So one student could be motivated by the need to pass an exam. The other student might be willing to travel to another country, maybe even go to live in another country where English is spoken. And another student might just be forced by their parents. Okay, so these are two different types of motivation. Some of these motivations are extrinsic, they're external, some of them are internal. But also the strengths of motivation. So two students might be motivated by needing to pass an exam, but one might be much more motivated than the other. Okay, so the strength of motivation can vary as well. Some of you have mentioned speed. Yes, so pace of learning definitely varies. We have seen that. All of us have seen that who teach. So some students may prefer or may be able to go faster. Some students may prefer or may want to or may only be able to go at a slower pace or at their own pace. That, of course, is very difficult to handle. Another one is interests. Yes, people have mentioned interests, and this could include hobbies, different types of preferences, and this means that it's quite rare that the whole class will be equally interested in reading a text on the same subject. So if you offer an activity, offer a project, whatever topic you come up with, naturally some students will be more interested than others. So that's a problem as well. Another one is needs. So this could be simple things. We have talked about exams. Yeah. So some students might be preparing for the local state exam. Others might be preparing for a TOEFL or an IELTS exam. Well, those are different. So you need to prepare different things. And this could be more complex, also special needs. So some students might have dyslexia. Some students might have ADHD. Okay. So these are not, things that need to be accommodated and things that need to be considered. And finally, yes, personalities. And someone just typed that in chat just as I put it on screen. Yes, exactly. So personalities obviously vary in a class, and this might affect the way that students interact in pairs, the way they interact in groups, the way they interact with you as a teacher. Some students could be talkative, some could be energetic, could be thoughtful, introverted, some could be calm, some could be optimistic, some could be self-confident, some could be less, some could be helpful. Okay, so all of these affect the interactions that happen in the class. So ultimately, what we're saying here is that our students are just different people. Oh, surprise, yes, they are different people. They're not all the same, and it's not just the proficiency level that differentiates them. It is basically everything about them that can be different and that can affect our teaching. So why does it matter? Why do we want to learn more about mixed ability teaching? Why do teachers keep asking about this? Well, if you think about your own teaching, your own experience, consider the different variables that we've talked about: the personality, the pace, the motivation, the proficiency levels. Can you think of any group that you have ever taught that was not mixed ability? Now, if anyone can think of a group that they have taught that was really not mixed ability, feel free to shout out, but I don't think that this will be the case. I think we'll be very surprised. So I think what we need to acknowledge is that mixed ability is actually the norm. It's not an exception. All classes in one way or another are mixed ability. Yes, exactly. People are saying no, 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 yes, in the chat. All classes, unless you're teaching one-to-one, of course, all classes are mixed ability. So it might be helpful to consider and think of mixed ability not as a type of class, because there isn't a special type of mixed ability class. Every class has mixed ability in some sense, but think of mixed ability as an approach to teaching. So perhaps traditionally, we might have thought of classes as a homogeneous group. So we might pretend that everyone in the class is roughly the same, and we teach them as if they are the same. But we know better now. So an approach that I'm suggesting is that we accept that our class is mixed ability. Okay, and the approach that we take, the mixed ability teaching approach, aims to recognize and accommodate the differences and the diversity. So we don't think that, okay, my class is mixed ability, but someone else's class isn't. Everyone's class is mixed ability. We just need to understand how to deal with it. So what are the main principles of mixed ability? So I will talk a bit about the principles first, and then after this, I will talk about some practical tips and some things that you can use in the classroom. So the main principles of the mixed ability teaching approach, first is to have flexible goals. Okay, so you need to be ready to adjust depending on how students cope, how they react to tasks, and make sure also to involve the students in the decision making, in the goal setting. And when I'm saying involve students in goal setting, I don't just mean their personal goals, but also group goals. Okay, you can involve students in making, setting group goals. The next principle is to focus on multiple skills, including what we call global skills or soft skills, which can be transferable. So not only language skills. It's not everything that we're teaching in the classroom, if we're honest. We're not just teaching language. So things like teamwork, critical thinking, problem solving, those skills are also very important. And there is no reason not to acknowledge that we are developing them in the classroom, and some students are getting stronger and better at these skills. Not equally across all the skills, of course. All right. The other principle is giving students more responsibility for their learning. Okay, we can't, as teachers, we can't be responsible for everyone's learning all the time. We need to involve students in this. We need to empower them. And this will also help to accommodate their individual needs, because if they're responsible, they know that they need to do something about it. It's not just up to the teacher. The teacher will not do the work for them. Okay, the other principle that I wanted to mention is focusing on collaboration, because, well, if we acknowledge that students are different, not only in terms of level, but also in terms of their pace, in terms of their interest, students with different levels of ability, different strengths, different interests, they can be a great source of knowledge and inspiration for each other. We need to encourage learning from each other, not just from the teacher, not just from the book. And in addition, collaboration is an important life skill, so it is worth developing anyway in any classroom. And the final principle I want to mention here is recognizing that proficiency is not a label. So somebody's not just B1, that's it. It is fluid, okay? So depending on the day, depending on the aspect that you're assessing, depending on which task you give them, depending on in which context they perform, how well they slept even, their performance, students' performance might be different, okay? So proficiency is fluid. It's not something constant. It can change. And also recognizing that gaps and mistakes are really opportunities, okay? Recognizing strengths in various areas, not only in language. Okay, students can have strengths in those other skills that we talked about. So it does really involve a bit of a new classroom culture, looking at mistakes as opportunities. Well, that's not something that every classroom can boast. All right. So what are the main challenges then in teaching mixed ability classrooms? In other words, why could it be difficult to implement these principles? Okay, so these principles seem quite sound and seem good. Why is it difficult to follow them? All right, let's think about it. I think one of the first problems that comes up is the differentiating materials and feedback. Okay, this essentially means having different versions of your material, of your task, and giving different feedback depending on the individual needs of each student. Now, that task is quite complex, and I think many of you have probably struggled with this. Now, one problem here, I think it's safe to say, is that there is often not enough differentiation in the materials that we're using. Okay, so there might be some suggestions in the teacher's book or even the student's book, but they may be limited or they may not work for your particular situation. So, as a result, this creates extra workload for you, for the teacher, because you now have to change the materials, you have to think of alternative tasks, and you have to give the different feedback. Now, this can also involve some practical issues, okay, because you might need to type up your adapted materials, you might need to print them out. An even bigger problem is setting up a differentiated activity. Now, you need to give different instructions to different groups of students, distribute different versions of your handouts, and give different feedback to everyone. Now, this sounds like a recipe for a disaster. This could create chaos, this could create confusion, which might undermine the whole approach. The students might not want to do it again if it ends up in chaos. Well, there's also no possibility to give personalized feedback to everyone at all times. Now, of course, there are alternatives, but they have their own problems. Now, we might think, okay, peer feedback is good, but some students don't see it as useful as the teacher's feedback. You could give group feedback, but that ignores some individual differences, okay? You can't address all the issues of individuals. You could give feedback outside of class, but that is a lot of extra work for you. So, are you able to put in those extra hours? What are you going to sacrifice in order to do that? So that is a problem. And finally, well, we are faced with the fact that most assessment, exams and tests that students need to take, have to take often, focus on language outcomes and not on global, soft, non-linguistic skills. Now, of course, it would be great if assessment was aligned with mixed ability teaching principles, if it helped foster the different skills, not only language. But unfortunately, high-stakes exams are usually not like that. And there's little that we as teachers can do about it. Yeah. So how do we address that? We'll talk about this a bit later. Another set of challenges. So this was all to do with the materials and how we struggle to find materials and feedback. The other set of challenges is motivation. So how do we motivate different students in a mixed ability classroom? The typical problem that you probably have, higher level students get bored, lower level students get frustrated, and both of those emotions, boredom and frustration, lead to disruptiveness, problems with discipline. This is why it is important to bring in non-language skills and expertise that students might have, focusing on meaning rather than just language, because focusing on language can lead to these emotions and these problems. Now, it can also be very difficult to deal with dominating students. We have seen the episode at the beginning with when the dominant student can often create frustration in the classroom. Now, simply silencing them is not really an option. You can't just tell them not to respond because you will frustrate the student and you will create a lot of negative energy in the classroom by that. Now, you need to think of ways to kind of rechannel their energy into maybe helping others. Now, it's easier said than done, I understand. But you could try numerous ways to tackle the problem of dominant students. For example, you could try a no hands up solution. So agree with your students that nobody is putting their hands up and you just call them out randomly. Okay, the way that you choose the random order is up to you. So it could be dice, it could be just pointing at people in the register, whatever. But sometimes taking this approach might help. You could use colored cards. So if each student has a set of 3 cards, they could use green to show you that they're confident, they understand. Yellow, they're not sure, they might need help. Red, they definitely don't understand. They have a question. They're falling behind. So that is a bit more discreet, and that gives you a picture of the whole class quite quickly. Or you could use something like mini whiteboards if you have an opportunity, obviously, so where students could write their answers or put a question mark if they have a question, and just display them to you. That's quite quick, gives you an overview of the whole class. So these are some of the ideas that you could try to avoid the problem of dominant students and shy students. But just a word of warning, before you try anything like that, it needs to be explained to the students, because if you just suddenly change your approach, now some students, especially those dominant students that tend to respond and now they don't have an opportunity, they might be a bit negative and resistant to such changes. So you do need to explain this is actually improving, for example, improving your efficiency in the classroom, and giving you more time to do something else. So explain why you're doing things, and frame it positively. So it's a positive change, not a way to tackle a problem, because, well, nobody wants to be seen as a problem. So it seems that implementing a mixed ability approach will probably require changing students' attitudes, changing the classroom culture. So it's kind of like a culture shift in the classroom. It could be quite fundamental. Otherwise, so if we don't change attitudes, it could be difficult for students and parents to accept, because they might be used to the traditional approach. Yeah. So they might be expecting you to focus on language, and they might think, well, why are you spending so much time developing their teamwork or critical thinking skills? They need grammar to succeed in their exams. Okay, so we need to change the attitudes to that before we can even try anything. Now, the institutions that we work for, they might rely on traditional assessment. They might be accountable. Students might have to take the exam, so it's not really up to us to change their goals. And finally, it might require questioning our own beliefs sometimes and our own practices. Yeah, so we might have to ask ourselves, why do I ask questions in class? Because if you really think about it, why do you ask questions in class? Is it to get the correct answers? Is it to reveal students' ignorance? Because very often, from the feedback that we give, even unconsciously, it might look like we were asking the question in order to get the correct answer, or in order to find which one of the students didn't know it. Okay, what we need to think about, is it really the goal, or are we trying to actually foster learning? Yeah, if we are trying to encourage learning, then maybe we should really praise questions rather than correct answers. Maybe we should encourage mistakes. Maybe we should say, that's great that you made a mistake. Now we can all learn from it, rather than expect correct answers, because expecting correct answers sets the wrong tone to the whole lesson. What is the goal of our lesson? Is it to ensure that everyone knows the correct answer, or is it to allow students to learn? Okay, so as you're thinking about this, we will move on to some practical tips. So what does mixed ability teaching look like in the classroom? All right, so first we'll talk about the ideas for differentiating our materials. So we said that this is quite a big problem. We often don't have enough, and it creates a lot of extra work for us. So first thing to remember is that we really need to avoid the average difficulty level, because if your group is, well, some students are A2 and some are B2, possibly even C1. Now, if you choose an average B1 level activity, this will only suit a very narrow group of students. Most students will find it either too difficult or too easy. So basically, you create the problems that we were talking about. Now, you might think, okay, so that means that I have to change something about my activity, yeah? Now, to make this task a bit easier, to make it a bit less daunting, let's think about different ways that we can change materials, because we don't necessarily have to change everything in the task, everything about our materials. We don't need to rewrite texts all the time in order to make them mixed ability. So we could change different elements of the task. We could change the material itself. But we also could change just the question or the task that the student needs to do based on this material. Or we could also adapt the output or the format of the response that they need to produce. Okay, whether it could be it's an essay, or it's a poster, or it's a list of words, or it's a picture even. Okay, now if you want to change the materials, okay, so the text, for example, you don't necessarily have to rewrite it, okay, or create 3 different versions of it. You could just add gaps, for example, for higher level students, and you could give clues to lower level students. For example, if you have a reading task, yeah, you could add visuals with keywords for lower level students. And for higher level students, you could remove some keywords or some grammar words, some functional words from the text and ask them to figure out what's missing. Okay, but you don't necessarily need to rewrite or change the whole text. All right. Now, if you would like to change the questions, so the material stays the same, we often want to use an authentic material, right? We want to bring in something from an authentic newspaper, from a real blog, a real news broadcast or something. So we don't necessarily want to change the task, but how can we change the questions then? Okay, or we could change the process of completing the task. Okay, well, here's an example. If you have a task such as a dictation, for example, what you could do is that lower level learners could be asked to just draw the main ideas. So no writing, they just focus on comprehension, understanding, and they draw the main ideas or draw a schema or something. Medium level learners could write down the main ideas. Okay, not every word, but just write down the main ideas. And for higher level students, you could ask them to actually try to write down as much as they can, in as much detail as they can. Here's another example. If you have a listening task, so let's say you're listening to, I don't know, a TED Talk, perhaps, yeah, that it may be a bit too difficult for some learners. So what you could do is you could give the transcript to the lower level students and ask them to underline keywords. That's it. Nice and easy. For medium level learners, they could do that. They could look at the transcript, but also answer some comprehension questions. Higher level students perhaps don't need the transcript. They could try answering the comprehension questions without looking at the transcript. So yeah, you don't do anything with the audio itself. All you need is to print out the transcript and give the 3 different tasks to students. Okay, now what if we try to change not the material itself, not the question, but the output, so what the students produce as a result. So if you have, for example, a project task, you could ask them to produce a storyboard, a vlog, a newspaper article, or a poem. Now, it would also be a good idea to provide a template of that, if you're asking that as an option to lower level students. Now, you could even let the students decide which format they want to use. So make it open-ended, but you'd need to give some examples, some guidance, some ideas, especially if it's the first time you're doing it. Now, notice that I didn't put the level of difficulty here. So is it more difficult to make a storyboard than to write a vlog, or is it more difficult to write a poem? Now, that will depend on learner strengths, on their interests, not necessarily linguistic skills, but also other skills. Now, one important thing here, very important, whatever options you provide, try to avoid always assigning learners to the task. So try to avoid telling, okay, you do the high level task, you do the medium level, you do the easy task, okay? At least sometimes let students choose, okay? You can limit the choices. You can give them 3 choices or more if you'd like, but they can choose themselves and trust your students. So this is about giving them a bit more responsibility, a bit more control. Trust them to choose the right option for them. Maybe sometimes a weaker student might want to try that slightly more difficult task, or maybe sometimes they want to stick with the easier one. So let them have that control, at least sometimes. Of course, sometimes you might want to be in control yourself, but at least sometimes you can do that. In fact, probably it's a good idea to remove these labels, high level, low level, okay, or more difficult, easier. Just label them option A, option B, option C, and always mix the order so it doesn't appear that option A is always the difficult one and option C is always the easy one. So let students consider them for their interest, for the how interesting the activity is for them, not just, oh, this is a difficult one, I'm not going to try it because it's too difficult. Okay, so just keep that in mind. All right, so we have talked about ideas for differentiating tasks. Now, what about motivating students? What are some of the things that we can do to tackle the problems with student motivation in a mixed ability class? So overall, the main principle is to try to give students more control, but reduce the pressure. Okay, how can we do that in practice? Well, one way is to focus on the process of learning rather than the correct answers. Yeah, so we talked about that. We're not there to just get the correct answers. We're there to help learning. So how can we do that? Well, for one thing, we could let students try again. Okay, and make it normal that trying again is fine. Everyone can try again. Even you as a teacher sometimes might role play if you have to. Doing something, if you make a mistake, try it again and make it normal. Okay, so the students can be encouraged to do that. And perhaps sometimes even giving the opportunity not to speak, okay, and without showing the frustration or, okay, yeah, you don't want to speak, fine. Just let students sometimes decide. You don't know what the reasons are for them not wanting to speak. Sometimes, okay, if they want their partner to respond instead of them, that's fine. Okay, don't make it too big of a deal out of it. Another thing that we could let students do is rehearse before speaking. So if we want a slightly longer answer, let them do it in pairs first or try it at home individually before they actually speak in front of a group. Okay, and make sure that they actually rehearse, because sometimes you ask students to rehearse, but they actually don't. So it may be a good idea to do it in class. Okay, another way to motivate involves giving students more options. Okay, it helps them feel more in control. For example, you could let them choose which activities to complete or which order to complete them in. So if you have a set of activities to do, let the students decide which order they want to go in. Sometimes make sure that you have slightly more than you want to complete so that they can choose which ones they prefer. And also include some optional challenges for the stronger students. For example, if you have a speaking task that everyone is doing, but if a student wants to, there can be a set of interesting phrases that they might try to incorporate in the speaking task. That could be a nice challenge. And the challenges don't necessarily have to be linguistic. Okay, could be just something to challenge their communication skills or other skills. You could require them to multitask, for example, to find and present additional information from the internet. Or to manage a group activity. So not only participate in the language activity, but also manage other people in the group. Okay. A way to reduce pressure is one way to do it is to vary the types and the format of feedback. So it's not always a mark, not always something that you check, but you could try and include more self-correction or peer correction. Now, I understand that sometimes teachers are concerned that this doesn't really work, yeah, because students don't know how to correct themselves, and they also might feel uncomfortable correcting their peers. So they might just say, yeah, you're doing great, that's fine, yeah, everything's okay, and there's nothing useful. And some students might feel that it's not very useful to get peer feedback. Well, they don't really say anything useful. So the key here to making this work is to teach them how to do it. So before you engage in this, provide some kind of rubric, some kind of guidance, give the tools. Maybe it's a table to fill in, ticks to put, some kind of framework to make their feedback more constructive. Okay, so give them 3 questions to answer, or rate something on a scale, for example. It is also important to model the feedback before you ask students to do it. Okay, so show them how it should be done. It could be an imaginary example. It doesn't have to be a real student that you make a model of, but just to show them how you would expect them to give feedback. All right. Now you could also let students find correct answers themselves. Okay, possibly working in groups. using all the tools that they can find, including the internet, books, each other. This will foster learner agency and again lower the pressure. So you are not the source of all the correct answers in the world. There are other sources which they are free to use. So sometimes don't give the answers yourself. Let them find them. Find them out. Make it a fun activity like a scavenger hunt. Okay, now let's discuss how do we encourage cooperation in a mixed ability class. So a common problem is that students might feel uncomfortable working together because of these different levels of skill that they have. Yeah, so one good way to counter that is to assign different roles. So the perfect example is, of course, a project. Yeah, so in a project, someone could be a writer, someone is a designer, someone is a note taker, and so on. And this could be according not only to their level of proficiency, but also to their interests, okay, to their special skills. Now, you could also ask them to take on different classroom activities, okay? So it's not necessarily in a project, but someone could be responsible for distributing and collecting handouts. Another person is responsible for timekeeping during the class. So these could be other activities that you ask different students to do. Now, another tip is to experiment and be creative about grouping students, okay, which you can do in several ways. So you could group them by proficiency, of course, yeah, by level. A group with similar level could work on a task that is most appropriate for them in terms of challenge. And you could also have a mixed level group, which is probably more realistic, where students are encouraged to ask questions and help each other. Okay, but another approach could be grouping by interests, which is especially appropriate for projects with multiple possible topics. Yeah? So students can be grouped by different interests. Finally, we can group by other skills. So to have a group with different strengths, someone good at design, someone good at technical skills, someone is a good organizer, someone's a good writer, good speaker, good actor, good negotiator. You might want to combine different talents in one group for something. And another idea is to include tasks which involve the kind of cooperation that can happen in real life, because that's ultimately what we're trying to prepare students for. For example, you could have students role play a situation where one student, possibly a higher level student, okay, but don't tell them that, acts as a translator between two others who are supposedly from different countries. Okay, so one could be speaking English and the other could be speaking their first language. And the student in between has to translate. This is as real as it gets, because this actually can happen. And this could be fun and an engaging way to make students cooperate. Now, this might lead to one question that many teachers ask. Now, should we or should we not use the first language in the class? If there is one first language in your classroom, obviously, because sometimes we can't do that if we have multiple. But if your class has one first language, should we use it? This is especially relevant for mixed ability classrooms because we might feel that some students really need that, but higher level students might feel under-challenged if we do that. The advice is to try to use it strategically. So if it solves a problem, okay, if it saves time to do something more important, if it helps learning, okay, but always try to sandwich it with English translation. So say something in English, then translate it into the L1 if you feel like you need to. Give an opportunity to higher level students to understand the instruction in English first, then give a translation if you have to. But always try to nudge students towards English. So the opportunities to use the L1 should be limited. So it shouldn't be just any time anyone can do it. There should be limited opportunities for that. And also don't forget to teach students to use dictionaries. So in this age, we might think, oh, everyone can use their phone, the internet to translate, but actually people have got worse at being able to read dictionaries and being able to use the information that's in the dictionaries, because Google Translate doesn't give you the information that a good dictionary does. It doesn't come naturally, so students do need to know how to read the different symbols and how to understand all the rich information that a dictionary can give. Okay, so the final area we're going to talk about today in terms of practical ideas is assessment. Again, this applies to English language teaching more generally, but is especially important for the mixed ability approach. So ideally, we said that assessment should align, of course, with the values of mixed ability teaching. Yeah, so it should encourage students to develop these global skills. It should help learning. It should test what really matters. Okay, and so we always need to think about, why are we testing students? We talked about this. Yeah, is it to get the correct answers? Is it to compare them to each other, or is it to help them learn, give them a sense of achievement? So when implementing assessment for learning, we want to try to highlight strengths, even if they are non-linguistic. Okay, so even if it's good teamwork, good critical thinking, even if the language was not that great, but we can find strengths to highlight. When we talk about mistakes, which inevitably happen, and problems that happen, frame them as areas of improvement. So things that could be done better in the future, with always adding concrete suggestions on what exactly they could do to improve on that. And don't feel like you always have to comment on every problem or every mistake. Be selective in that way. Here's an example of what you could try to apply the principles of assessment for learning. So first, this is called a two-step testing procedure. So first, let the students try a test independently, but make sure that they understand that there will be one more attempt. Okay, so this is not going to be marked. This is just the first attempt. When they finish, only tell them which answers are correct on their sheets, and then ask them to collaborate to find the other answers. Okay, so encourage them to use any suitable resources, so dictionaries, the internet, and of course each other. Ask each other, which answers did you get correct? Can you explain this to me? So when everybody has figured out all the answers and all the questions, and you feel confident that they have understood what their problems were, let them try the test again. Okay, of course, this time they won't be looking at their first attempt, so they're trying to do it again with the knowledge of the correct answers they already have. For an additional challenge, you might want to delay this second attempt to the next lesson or next week, perhaps. Yeah. So this is something that you can try to actually use the test as a tool to learn, and not just as a tool to tell someone, well, you're 80% great and you're only 60% good. Okay, so let us summarize the main points from today's presentation. So first, we have said that mixed ability is the norm. It is not an exception. Yeah. Most classes are mixed ability in one way or another. There are different factors. Okay, it's not just proficiency. It's different motivation, different pace, different needs, different interest, different personality even. Yeah. For this reason, we should view mixed ability as an approach. This is how we teach. We teach by trying to accommodate and trying to foster diversity and mixed talents, if you will. It's not just a special type of class. Okay, it's an approach that we take. The approach is aimed at encouraging, recognizing various skills, and not just language skills. Yeah, so including global skills, soft skills, and learning from each other, not just from the teacher or from the book. Okay, and remember that implementing a mixed ability approach requires a shift in the classroom culture, giving more control to students, reducing the pressure on them as much as you can. This could be achieved in a number of ways, some of which we have discussed in more detail, but most notably by giving students options and by encouraging effort and learning from mistakes rather than expecting correct answers as much as we can. Obviously, there are situations where we can't quite do that, when we actually have a real test that we need to report. They actually have exams. We all understand that. But as much as we can, if we can foster this approach and this attitude in the class, that should help. All right, good. I think we have just about come to questions.
So there are some in the Q&A tab. If you
Yes, let me just have a look. Okay, Julia is asking, if there is a student in an A2 level group who even can't read, he just missed 4 primary years of learning English, and the group is making progress, but he's literally learning reading. Okay, so the question is, I guess, if you really have that one student who's really falling behind and everyone else is kind of ahead, this is a really difficult situation, I must admit. So I think the first thing that you need to try to do is try to identify what other strengths does the student have. So obviously reading is not their strength, perhaps language isn't, but what is it that they can do well? Is it perhaps something technical? Do they have any other talents like, I don't know, drawing, music, something extracurricular? It could be sport, anything at all that could be teamwork. Okay, are they good at collaborating with the team? Are they good at finding out information, even if it's in their first language? Okay, so it doesn't necessarily have to be in English for those purposes. So try to use whatever their strength is in whenever they work in a group or in a pair. Try to let them show their strengths, whatever it is, and focus a bit less on their weakness, which is obviously reading. Now, whatever success they have in reading, obviously this needs to be recognized. Okay, and some of the tips that we have discussed. So letting students find the answers. Okay, letting them figure it out and letting them learn from each other. So ask others questions perhaps would be helpful, so the student doesn't feel like they always have to go to you as a teacher or to the book, but they can use their peers to help, and hopefully they have friends in the group that they can talk to. If they don't have friends, it could be a bit more difficult, but still. So yeah, basically my advice is try to leverage whatever other talents they have to boost their confidence a bit. And so all the things that we talked about of differentiation, that should help. Okay. Can you explain how, Henda, thanks for the question. Can you explain how we differentiate in terms of the process? Okay, so that means, I think I gave the example of the questions, that you can differentiate the questions, but the process, maybe I didn't give such a good example. That is true. Let me have a look back. So in terms of process, this could mean, so if you have a project, for example, in which sequence do the learners proceed, okay? Do they need to sit down and write a draft of whatever it is that you gave them a task to do, okay? Or could they have some options? Could they, for example, take this home, do some research, then come back and collaborate to finish it off? Could they put off the writing? Could they break down the writing into 2 different stages? So maybe write a first draft, get your opinion, then check it and do it, improve it. So varying the sequence of activities within your project or say bigger task, that could differentiate the process. Okay, so whether you ask them, I think the example with the dictation was a bit similar, a bit more relevant to this. So whether you ask them to write everything in detail or just write the main ideas, that could also differentiate the process in learning. All right, I hope that gives you some ideas. Angelica, how do you distribute tasks amongst the students with different level without upsetting them? Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the thing that would help is not to label the tasks as difficult, easy, and medium. And perhaps including several tasks that are a bit more difficult and several tasks that are a bit easier. And also, you can differentiate tasks not only in terms of their difficulty level, but also in terms of interest. Okay, so some students might be more interested in trying to write something like fiction, a story or a poem. Some students might not be interested in that. Some students might be more interested in creating a vlog or something like that. So try to give different options that are not necessarily always different level of proficiency. So they could just speak to different students in terms of their interest. And also, so let students choose options as much as you can. So you give the 3 or 4 different options, but don't tell that, okay, this is for the strong students, this is for you and for you. This is for the weaker students, this is for you. Just put them out there. Let students choose, trust them to make the right choice and to choose what is appropriate for them. And if they don't choose what's appropriate, that's a good lesson for them. So they will know their level and they will know that, okay, this is a bit too difficult. Maybe I'll try it next time. And this time I'll stick with something easier. Okay, what other questions that we have? Oh, we have quite a few. Let me see. A question about virtual education from Carla. So how can we improve games that we used to do before the pandemic? And nowadays, virtual education is increasing as students don't have contact with their partners. Games are not the same. Oh, yes, I can relate to that. So when I guess you're talking about the fact that before the pandemic, everything was face-to-face. You could sit down around the table and play a nice board game that was engaging for students. And well, now you can't really do that because it becomes really difficult. So if you can't return face-to-face, which I mean, some places are returning face-to-face, but if you can't do that, I guess you kind of have to embrace the digital opportunities. So the things that are fun online for learners could be, creating vlogs, creating TikTok videos, writing something on social media, creating posts, profiles, things like that. They could work on together. They could, I mean, some of the more technically advanced students could create a website together, so or just a page. So yes, games could be a bit more difficult, although you could find apps probably where students could play together. Throwing dice and moving counters around the board, that fun is a bit difficult online, but you can do other things. So yeah, think about, what are the fun things? What are the games online that would be great for students? Okay. Right. Another question. Okay, the age from Dihane. Sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. A group aged between 10 and 12 years old, only 2 students who are 7 years old. How to deal with these two when it comes to assessment? Now, obviously, you have to be careful, and that depends on your context. So do you have the same requirements for the 7-year-olds as you do for the 12 and the 10 and 12-year-olds? So if the requirements are slightly lower, now obviously it would be a good idea to try to make sure that students are not aware that some of them are assessed to a different standard than everyone else. So trying to be discreet about it is probably a good idea. But also, again, so what we were talking about, leveraging other talents. So not just focusing on their proficiency level, but praising and involving their other abilities as much as we can, to boost their confidence and to really communicate to students that it's not just language level that we care about. Okay, yes, of course we have tests and we have assessments, fine. But we as teachers, we care about other skills as well. We know that you need language to communicate, to do things in life and not just to pass tests. So try to communicate that with your attitude and with what you do in class as much as you can. That's basically what I would try to do. Okay, another question. Yes, I guess the summative assessment comes up quite a bit. So Margarita is asking, how does this approach relate to students' final mark? If they had different tasks, how can you mark them? That's a very good question. So you have to kind of differentiate between things that you're using for practice, things that you're using for formative assessment. So formative assessment, you give feedback, you give suggestions, but this is not part of their final mark that is given as the end of unit or semester or year. And also summative. Okay, so summative assessment is where they do need to get a mark. And obviously for summative assessment, you will need to have students try the test in equal conditions. So you can't let them, ask each other. You can't let them use the internet in the summative assessment. So it's a matter of differentiating and communicating to the students that, yes, we do need to take summative assessment just to benchmark how we're progressing, okay? But that's only one part, that's only one aspect of learning a language, okay? So that's not all of it. That's not all we care about, okay? And try to show through all those other activities that you actually care about other skills, and you care about allowing them to learn, not only assessing how well they have done. Okay. Let's see. Another good question from Solomon Paul. Don't you think that when we assign different roles, some of them lose the chance of acquiring primary language skill? That's a good question. So you mean that if we assign someone the role of, let's say, technical design, but someone else gets to be the writer and someone else gets to be the speaker or the presenter, then we are kind of depriving the person who's doing the technical task of the opportunity to practice the language. That's a very good point. So I guess you need to be mindful that you don't always assign the same roles to the same students, okay? So, and you don't always allow them to choose the roles themselves. So sometimes it needs to be randomized, and sometimes they need to experiment a little bit. So make sure that those who tend to gravitate to the non-language tasks, that at least sometimes they take the simpler language-related tasks on. So they won't necessarily be ready for to give a presentation in front of a class, which is fine. And we don't want to put a student on the spot who's not ready to speak in front of the whole class and just make them do it. But we need to think of some simpler, smaller tasks. Perhaps they can do an introduction to the presentation that other people in the group will be continuing. So, try to build in some blocks that could be a bit easier to build their confidence. But yes, it is a very good point that you do need to make sure that students don't always gravitate to the same roles, especially if they are not very linguistic. That is very true. Very good point. Okay. Kotar is asking, what about teaching mixed abilities in a large class? This is somehow hard. I can imagine. I'm not going to ask how large your class is, but I can imagine that in some context it could be 30, 40, 50 people, perhaps, depending on your context. So yes, obviously this is very hard, and this is not a situation that we want to find ourselves in. But if that's your reality, well, you have to work with it. So what can you do? I would say you have to rely on peer feedback and peer help a lot more with a large class. This could be difficult in terms of discipline, and this could be difficult in terms of motivation, but spend some time talking to students about the value of teaching each other and helping each other, and give them tools how to help each other. So give them scales, tables, rubrics that they can use to help each other, and let them do the teaching kind of within their groups. So if you have a good idea of who the stronger students are, try to put them in different groups and let them help, basically, without explicitly asking them, that you are the stronger student, now you help everyone else. So try to make it a bit more discreet, but try to leverage your strong students. Talk to everyone about the value of helping each other and give them the tools. And yes, you have to rely a lot more on the peer feedback and the peer help in this kind of context, I would imagine. Okay, let's see, maybe a couple more questions.
You read my mind. I was going to say probably time for two more.
Two more. Okay, good. Okay, Gloria is asking, mixing students with different levels. What's your opinion? I mean, the most skillful somewhat aiding the less? Yes. So there are obviously dangers with this. So you put different level students in the same group, and you find that the student who's higher level does all the speaking, everyone else is just listening to them. Okay, and you might think, oh, that's not a great situation, but actually this isn't bad, because if the higher level student models good language, or at least better language than the others, at least they're listening and engaging and getting something from that. But one thing to make sure to try to involve others in the group, the weaker students in speaking, is to, again, talk to students. Yes, don't keep it a secret. Tell them that this is really important to help each other and to try to experiment. Okay, so when they're in a small group, you are not assessing them because nobody's checking what they're saying. They can try, okay? And if it doesn't work, they can try it again, okay? So normalize this idea that, okay, it's not every day is a final test, okay? We can try things again. We can rehearse them, okay? We can mix up in a different group and try again, whatever you were talking about, with another group. So on the one hand, yes, try to encourage the weaker students to talk, but it's not always a bad thing if they don't talk, but if you just listen to the stronger students. That's not always a bad idea, actually. All right, let's take on maybe the last question. Right, Musa is asking, is it possible to use mixed ability in a multilingual classroom? Yes, so I was talking about using the first language, which can be helpful, yes. So if you have a multilingual group, obviously you can't use the first language because they all speak different first languages. Now, that's an advantage in some sense because you have to use English. On the other hand, this deprives you of this very useful tool that you can use to help the weaker students using their first language. So the only thing that I can advise here is that you need to be creative about relying on non-linguistic cues, such as visual aids, okay, the things around you, the body language. And also, if you do have a few students from the same language group, let them sometimes work together. Not all the time, because usually that ends up being, a conversation in their first language. But sometimes let them work together so that they can sometimes help each other. So yeah, balancing there, but generally I would hope that you could actually benefit from students having to use English more. But yeah, I can understand that you do need the help of the first language, especially at lower levels. Okay, so I hope that helps.